In a laboratory at Tel Aviv University, a molecular biologist is looking at a screen and he has just stopped moving. In front of him is a genetic sequence. He pulled it not from blood, not from bone, but from a pinch of dust scraped off the bottom of a storage box. The dust came from a single fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls, one small piece of animal skin that has survived 2,000 years in a desert cave. And the sequence is telling him something that does not fit. The animal whose hide became that fragment could not have been alive anywhere near the cave where it was found. Not for a season, not for a single day. For 70 years, everyone who studied these scrolls asked the same question. What do they say? Generation after generation of scholars treated it as the only question worth asking. Almost nobody thought to ask the other one. What are they made of? That second question had been sitting there the whole time, unopened, through every study and every decade of argument, and when someone finally asked it and finally pulled an answer out of the dust, it began to take apart nearly everything scholars believed about the most famous manuscripts on Earth. So here is what I want you to sit with before we go on. The thing that unravels this story is not a new text, not a hidden passage, not a secret code buried in the ink. It is a single cow. One animal that should not exist in this collection at all. Stay with me, because once you understand why that one animal is impossible, you cannot look at the Dead Sea Scrolls the same way again. To understand why one strand of ancient DNA mattered so much, you have to go back to where this began. To a hillside above the Dead Sea, and a shepherd who had no idea he was about to change history. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Dib was chasing a goat that had wandered off along the shore of the Dead Sea. When he reached the mouth of a cave in the cliffs, he threw a stone inside just to see if the animal might bolt out. Instead, he heard something shatter. He climbed in. What he found were clay jars sealed for centuries, holding leather scrolls wrapped carefully in linen. He had no way of knowing what he had stumbled onto. Neither did anyone else, not yet. He had gone looking for a lost goat. He had found the single most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Over the next 9 years, between 1947 and 1956, the caves gave up their contents piece by piece. Roughly 25,000 fragments, representing close to 1,000 separate manuscripts, pulled from 11 caves near the ruins of a site called Qumran. Inside them were the oldest known copies of Genesis, of Isaiah, of the Psalms. Beside those sat sectarian rule books, hymns, and visions of the end of the world. The texts spanned from around 250 years before the Common Era to 68 years after it. The single most volatile stretch in the history of both Judaism and the earliest Christian movement, sealed away in the dry Judean desert. The find set off a scramble. Bedouin searchers and teams of archaeologists combed the cliffs, racing each other from cave to cave, and one of them, a cave the researchers labeled Cave 4, gave up the richest haul of all. Tens of thousands of tiny scraps, the remains of hundreds of separate scrolls, torn and scattered across the floor. Reassembling them would consume entire careers. A small circle of scholars held the rights to study and publish the material, and for decades much of it stayed locked away, released to the wider world only in pieces, until the archive was finally opened to all researchers in the early 1990s. The scrolls were famous long before most of them could even be read. These scrolls had quietly outlived the Second Temple. They had outlived Rome. They had outlived every empire that rose and fell across the 2,000 years above them. And when scholars finally opened them, the text did not hand over easy answers. They handed over questions that would take 70 years even to begin to answer. Where had they come from? Who had written them, and why were they hidden away in this one particular corner of the desert above all others? For most of those 70 years, scholars believed they had the answer. They were wrong. Researchers from institutions all over the world pored over every visible detail these fragments offered. They worked with nothing but their eyes, their training, and their instincts. They compared handwriting, stroke by stroke. They studied the color and texture and thickness of the parchment, hoping to match pieces back to a single source animal. They cross-referenced language, theology, calendar systems, literary structure, anything that might reveal a pattern. And a theory took hold. It pointed to the Essenes. The Essenes were a Jewish sect described by ancient historians like Josephus and Pliny the Elder. A secluded, monastic community living in the Judean wilderness, devoted to purity, to copying scripture, and to the coming of divine judgment on a corrupted world. The ruins at Qumran, sitting right beside the caves, looked exactly like the kind of settlement Josephus had described. The pieces seemed to fit together almost too well. And the ruins themselves seemed to say the same thing. Excavations at Qumran uncovered a network of stepped pools cut into the rock, fed by channels that caught the rare desert rain, the kind of ritual baths a community obsessed with purity would need. There was a long communal room that looked built for shared meals. There was a chamber holding the remains of plastered benches and tables that one excavator read as a scriptorium, a room for copying scripture, and spread out beside the settlement lay a cemetery of more than 1,000 graves, the overwhelming majority of them men, a celibate brotherhood of scribes in the wilderness. It was exactly the picture the ancient historians had painted. The sectarian texts described a self-contained religious community with its own leadership, its own laws, and a solar calendar that broke sharply from the lunar calendar kept by the priests in Jerusalem. That was not a small disagreement, it was a direct theological challenge to the temple establishment. The apocalyptic writings burned with hostility toward that same establishment. One of them, the War Scroll, described a final cosmic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. It read exactly like something a breakaway sect would write to make sense of its own exile from mainstream Jewish life, so the conclusion felt airtight. The Essenes lived at Qumran. They copied their scripture there, and when Rome crushed the Jewish revolt in 68 of the Common Era, they hid their library in the surrounding caves to keep it safe. For decades, that was the accepted story, taught in seminaries, featured in museum exhibitions, repeated in documentary after documentary. The Dead Sea Scrolls were the private collection of one desert sect. Case closed. Nothing left to debate. Stay with this, because everything you just heard is about to come apart at the seams. The Essene theory held for 70 years, but underneath it, uncomfortable details kept surfacing. Details the tools of the time simply could not resolve. The scrolls showed wild, almost bewildering variation. Different versions of the same biblical book sat side by side. Different scripts, different hands, different levels of skill. Parchment ranged from expertly prepared skins to rough, almost amateurish material sitting right next to each other in the same cave. And when radiocarbon dating was finally applied to a sample of fragments in the early 1990s, some scrolls turned out to be older than the Qumran settlement itself. The chronology did not add up the way the theory required, and underneath all of it sat a deeper puzzle nobody could answer. Why would one isolated, tightly disciplined sect hold on to multiple contradictory versions of its own sacred texts? Take the book of Jeremiah. 2 entirely different editions survived among the scrolls, one substantially longer than the other, with whole passages missing and chapters rearranged. Why would a community supposedly built on rigid religious uniformity keep both? It was not only Jeremiah. Across the collection, the same book could appear in forms that disagreed with each other, in handwriting that ranged from the work of trained scribes to something far cruder. A disciplined sect guarding a single pure tradition would have no reason to preserve texts that contradicted its own beliefs. It would have every reason to destroy them. And yet there they were, side by side in the dark. The scale of the variety was the part that never quite fit. The scrolls were not written in one language, but 3: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. They were copied, scholars came to believe, not by a handful of scribes, but by hundreds of different hands, and they did not contain only the books that would later become the Bible. Alongside Genesis and Isaiah sat works that never made it into any canon, books like Enoch and Jubilees, and writings nobody had ever seen before at all. If this was one small sect's private shelf, it was a sect with a strangely enormous and self-contradicting appetite. A few scholars floated other ideas at the margins of the field. Maybe Qumran was not a monastery at all. Maybe it was a pottery workshop, a winter estate, a military outpost. Maybe the caves were something stranger, a sacred depository, where worn-out texts from many different communities were brought to be respectfully retired rather than destroyed. These ideas existed, but none of them carried the hard evidence needed to bring down a theory that had held for generations. And then something arrived from a direction nobody in the field expected. Not an archaeologist, not a theologian, a geneticist over lunch. In 2012, at a table in Tel Aviv University, a molecular biologist named Oded Rechavi sat down with a biblical scholar named Noam Mizrahi. The conversation drifted, the way conversations between old colleagues do, toward the Dead Sea Scrolls, toward the maddening difficulty of matching thousands of tiny disconnected fragments, toward the questions 70 years of careful scholarship had never managed to close. Mizrahi laid it out plainly. 25,000 fragments, no titles, no page numbers, no reliable way to connect one piece of parchment to another beyond comparing handwriting and making educated guesses about how old the skin looked. Methods that were subjective, imprecise, and capable of being catastrophically wrong without anyone ever realizing it. Rechavi listened, then he asked one simple question. What are the scrolls actually made of? Parchment, Mizrahi told him. Animal skin. Rechavi paused for a long moment. Parchment, he said, has DNA. That single sentence opened an entire field of inquiry that nobody had thought to pursue. Rechavi worked in ancient DNA, a method that had already rewritten the study of human prehistory, tracing migrations and population history across tens of thousands of years. And sitting at that table, he realized something that should have been obvious years earlier and somehow never was. Nobody had ever pointed that method at a manuscript, at scripture itself. Think about what that means. For 70 years, some of the most careful scholars alive had studied these texts with everything available to them, and the material the texts were written on, the skin itself, had been treated as a blank surface, a thing to hold the ink, not a document in its own right, not a body with a history of its own, and every one of those skins had once been an animal that lived somewhere, drank from some particular water, grazed on some particular land, and died in some particular place. If you could read the animal, you could in principle read the geography. You could ask where a scroll was truly born, not from the words on it, but from the creature underneath them. Nobody had ever asked a holy text that question before. To a molecular biologist, it was almost strange that no one had. Rechavi had spent his life reading DNA as a record of where living things came from and how they were related. To him, a 2,000-year-old sheepskin was not only a page, it was a carcass with an address. But to the scholars who had lived inside these texts for decades, the skin had always been the one part of the scroll that did not speak. The idea that it might hold a second hidden document, written in a language no scribe ever intended, took a moment to absorb. Together with Penina Shaw, who had spent her career as custodian of the scrolls at the Israel Antiquities Authority, Rechavi and Mizrahi assembled a small team to chase something no one had ever attempted before. And what they found along the way would unsettle even the people who had spent their whole lives protecting these fragile, irreplaceable texts. Here was the first obstacle, and it was serious. The Dead Sea Scrolls are sacred to more than one faith, and by definition, they are entirely irreplaceable. Any method that involved cutting, drilling, or removing physical samples was off the table from the start. The scrolls had to stay whole, untouched. So how do you read the genetic history of something you are absolutely forbidden to touch? The answer had been sitting there the entire time, hiding in plain sight. Inside the storage boxes, decades of careful handling had left behind fine particles of parchment dust, quietly gathering at the bottom of the containers. That dust held collagen, the structural protein in animal skin, and locked inside the collagen, preserved across 2,000 years, was ancient genetic material. By collecting dust from blank margins and worn edges, from places where no writing had ever been, the team could gather what they needed without ever touching a single inked letter. The evidence had been waiting in that dust the whole time, through every study, through every decade of debate. But turning that dust into usable sequences was brutal work. The very process of making parchment, the soaking, the scraping, the stretching, the drying, damages DNA at the molecular level. The iron-based inks used on many scrolls are chemically corrosive. And after all of that, the scrolls spent 2,000 years in desert caves, then passed through the hands of hundreds of researchers over the following 70. Each one a possible source of modern contamination. A single stray skin cell from a curator's hand could drown out a 2,000-year-old signal completely. The thing they were trying to read was faint, broken, and buried under 70 years of everyone who had ever tried to help. So the team worked inside dedicated ancient DNA facilities that looked more like clean rooms than archives, full protective suits, positive air pressure, ultraviolet sterilization. They built strict protocols to prove their results were genuinely ancient and not the fingerprints of a modern hand, hunting for the patterns of molecular decay that only accumulate across centuries, running samples through separate extractions, cross-checking every result between independent laboratories. It took years, hundreds of samples, repeated failure. They were often working from mere milligrams of powder, coaxing a broken, incomplete genome out of material that had spent 2 millennia falling apart. Every promising signal had to be run again, extracted again, confirmed in a second laboratory before anyone would trust it. But in the end, they assembled reliable genetic sequences from dozens of fragments, and when Rachavi finally sat down with what those sequences showed him, he reached for his phone. Most of the fragments came back exactly as expected: sheepskin, the standard material used throughout ancient Judea, taken from an animal fully capable of surviving in a harsh desert like the one around Qumran. No surprise there, no story there. But a handful of fragments came back as something else, something that should not have been possible: cowhide. No Mizrahi stared at that result for a long time. He knew Qumran intimately, the texts, the terrain, the long and difficult history of the site, and he sat with the data in silence before he said anything to anyone. Because cow parchment at Qumran was not a small anomaly to be tucked into a footnote and forgotten. It was physically, geographically impossible. Qumran sits in the Judean desert, beside the Dead Sea, in one of the harshest, driest environments anywhere on the planet. Sheep and goats can live there. They are built for arid land, for very little water, for the tough scrub that would starve most other animals. Cattle cannot. A single cow needs dozens of gallons of water every day and real grazing pasture just to stay alive, let alone thrive. There was no version of a community living at Qumran that could have raised cattle beside it. Cow parchment could not have been made in that desert. Full stop. To keep a single cow alive out there, you would have to haul it water by the barrel every day, across ground that barely supports a goat. Multiply that by a herd large enough to supply skins for scrolls, and the whole idea collapses under its own thirst. Nobody was raising cattle on the shore of the Dead Sea. It simply could not be done. Which meant that any scroll written on cowhide had come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere with real water and real grassland, somewhere far from the cave it ended up in. The theory was not slightly off, it was wrong, and it was one single cow that made it undeniable. When that result crossed Penina Shaw's desk at the Israel Antiquities Authority, she stopped reading and simply sat with it. She had spent her entire career as the custodian of these fragments. She knew the dust in those storage boxes better than most people know the rooms of their own homes. She read the finding twice, slowly to be sure she understood it. She would later describe it as feeling like the room had tilted beneath her. This was not only a challenge to the Essene theory, it was a challenge to the entire framework scholars had built for understanding what the Dead Sea Scrolls even were. And the cowhide was not scattered randomly across the collection, which would have been strange enough on its own. It clustered around specific texts, around specific versions of specific books, which is exactly where the genetics get stranger still. Here is what the team could now do that no one before them had ever managed. By comparing genetic markers across different parchment samples, they could tell whether two separate fragments came from the very same animal. Two pieces of parchment cut from one sheep carry nearly identical mitochondrial DNA. Two pieces from different sheep do not. For 70 years, matching fragments had rested entirely on guesswork, on handwriting and instinct. Now, for the first time, there were actual fingerprints written into the material itself. Take Jeremiah again, the clearest case of all. Remember the two versions, one long, arranged in the familiar order of the Hebrew Bible read today. The other, noticeably shorter, missing whole sections, its chapters rearranged. Before 1947, the earliest Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament available anywhere dated only to around 1,000 years into the Common Era. For decades after the scrolls emerged, scholars argued endlessly about what these two Jeremiahs meant. An early draft, a later revision, a scribe's mistake. The DNA gave a physical answer to a debate that had run for a generation. The shorter version of Jeremiah was written on cowhide. The longer version was written on sheepskin. Different animals, almost certainly different regions. These were not two copies of one original slowly drifting apart. They were two separate textual traditions developed independently in two different communities in two different parts of ancient Judea. Read that again because it is the heart of the whole thing. Two communities, two Bibles, sitting side by side in the same cave. The team ran the same analysis on another text, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, a liturgical work describing angelic worship inside the heavenly temple. Copies of it were found both at Qumran and at Masada, the mountaintop fortress where Jewish rebels made their final stand against Rome in 73 of the Common Era. The DNA showed that multiple Qumran fragments of this one text came from entirely different animals. This was not the guarded exclusive property of a single isolated sect. It was popular, widely copied, produced independently in more than one place. Then came the kinship analysis, and it added another layer still. By reading nuclear DNA markers, the researchers could sometimes identify parchments made from closely related animals, siblings, members of the same flock. Clusters of related animals pointed towards specific production centers, places where several scrolls had clearly been made from local skins within the same narrow window of time. And here is the detail that mattered most. Some of those tight clusters, clearly produced together from a single flock, turned up mixed in among fragments with no genetic relationship at all. Different animals, different flocks, different origins entirely. There was a quieter revolution hidden in that same method. Fragments that scholars had confidently assigned to the same scroll for decades could now be tested, and some of them turned out to come from different animals altogether, which meant they had never belonged together at all. Others, long kept apart, matched. The genetic thread could reconnect pieces that handwriting alone had separated and pull apart pieces that handwriting had wrongly joined. 70 years of painstaking reconstruction suddenly had a way to be checked. This was not a collection that had grown out of one central scriptorium. It had been gathered from many points of origin, representing many communities scattered across the region, spanning decades, quite possibly stretching across whole centuries. The idea of a single sect's private library did not just crack under this weight, it came apart completely. Here is what all of this actually means if the scrolls had truly come from one isolated sect living at Qumran. Their sheer diversity would make almost no sense. Why would a single disciplined community preserve competing versions of its own scripture? Why keep texts arguing for positions it rejected instead of simply destroying them? But if the collection had been gathered from many different communities, brought into these caves gradually over decades, and finally sealed away by one catastrophe, then suddenly everything falls into place. The diversity is not a problem to explain away, it is the entire point. The genetics backed up something a few scholars had suspected for years but could never prove. These caves, the same ones Muhammad Eddib's stone broke open in 1947, had served as a geniza, a sacred storehouse where Jews from many communities brought texts too holy to destroy but no longer fit for daily use. Jewish law forbids discarding any document that bears the divine name. Such texts have to be preserved respectfully in places kept for exactly that purpose. Now picture the map. Jerusalem sits barely 20 miles from Qumran, a manageable journey by ancient standards. When Rome laid siege to the city between 68 and 70 of the Common Era, Jews fleeing that destruction may well have carried whatever sacred scrolls they could rescue out into the desert, adding them to a collection other communities had already been building there for generations. Family scrolls, synagogue scrolls, fragments of an entire world rescued as everything familiar collapsed. So these caves were never the private archive of one order living apart from the world. They were a shared library holding the sacred literature of the whole of ancient Israel. And that changes something much larger than one archaeological argument. The world that Jesus was born into was not a place of settled, comfortable agreement about Scripture. It was a patchwork of scattered, competing communities, each convinced it held the authentic tradition. There was no single accepted text of Jeremiah floating above the argument. There were versions, shorter, longer, differently arranged, each treated as the true Bible by whoever happened to keep it. Canonization was not a finished thing handed down from above. It was still underway, still contested. And the DNA had now shown that physically in the skin, not merely in theory. That is the honest place this story ends, not with a solved case. With a cave full of voices that no longer belonged to one sect, a Bible that was still being decided, and a scientific method so new that the questions it opens may end up mattering more than the ones it closed. Researchers are already expanding the DNA work to more fragments, pairing it with imaging that recovers writing invisible to the eye, and building reference libraries of ancient animal DNA from across the Near East. The goal is a map precise enough that a single scrap of parchment could reveal roughly where in the ancient world its animal once lived. Pin down the DNA of animals from known regions, and a scrap of unknown origin could be placed on that map by its skin alone. The web of communities that made these texts invisible for 2,000 years might slowly be drawn back into view, one fragment at a time. The reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not finished. In many ways, it is only now truly beginning. So here is what I want to leave you with. Do you think the story written in the skin of these scrolls will one day let us map the entire lost network of communities that made them? Or are there origins that DNA will never quite reach? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and the sharpest thinking often comes from you. And if a single lunch conversation quietly rewriting the history of Scripture is the kind of story that grabs you, subscribe and tap the bell so you are here when the next discovery refuses to stay buried.